Israel's prime minister has been calling images of starving babies fake and is denying that his country is using a policy of starvation to win the war in Gaza, even as a majority of the starvation deaths in the occupied territory have occurred in just the last few weeks.
Now, if we had a starvation policy, no one in Gaza would have survived after 2 years of war. But our policy has been the exact opposite.
Israel denies the charge that it is weaponizing food to win the war in Gaza because it's illegal to do that under international law. Israel actually began controlling food going into Gaza since 2007. Back then, a senior advisor to the prime minister said, quote, "The idea is to put Palestinians on a diet, but not to make them die of hunger." The goal was to use hunger to turn the public against Hamas, which had come to power after winning a 2006 election and survived a subsequent American-backed coup attempt. When those attempts to oust Hamas, which the West considers a terrorist organization, failed, the blockades began, and documents obtained by an Israeli human rights group show that the security establishment had established a number of calories that Gazan residents consumed so it could establish a, quote, humanitarian minimum or a bottom line so it could reduce the food supply into Gaza without causing hunger or malnutrition. That ongoing blockade since 2007 meant Gaza grew dependent on foreign humanitarian aid to survive. And after Hamas attacked Israel in October of 2023, Israel began to cut that off too.
אנחנו מטילים מצור מוחלט על העיר עזה. אין חשמל, אין מזון, אין מים, אין דלק. הכל סגור.
Within months of the siege beginning, Human Rights Watch accused Israel of committing the war crime of weaponizing food. The evidence behind those allegations have become way more obvious since March of 2025, when Israel banned UN aid agencies from operating, which has led to the famine conditions that we're seeing today. Now, the UN warns that 39% of Gazans are going days at a time without food, and starvation deaths are expected to grow exponentially as Israel invades the last pockets of Gaza, which it doesn't control militarily. The Zionist strategy of controlling food supplies with one hand and waging a genocidal war in the other is the same strategy that American settlers used to take over indigenous lands during their colonial expansion out west. From the 1820s to the end of the 19th century, the US military and settler militias were incentivized to wipe out the American bison, which was a central food resource for many First Nations west of the Mississippi River. Once numbering 30 to 60 million, bison populations were decimated to just a few hundred by 1890. And with no access to the bison, many indigenous people starved, as the US military waged wars that are remembered today for their brutality, including several massacres of innocent women and children. Like what's happening in Palestine, these wars ended with First Nations being forced to sign away their lands to settlers, as they were moved to reservations and were made dependent on food aid rations that were provided to them by their colonizers. And after all of this, America would pioneer another colonial technique that Israelis would later emulate. In the name of conserving the very bison that they had nearly wiped out, America established its first national park, Yellowstone, which gave it the authority to further criminalize indigenous hunting and food gathering practices on once native land by framing these very indigenous practices as threats to the vulnerable species that they once protected. Like America, Israel also uses the concept of national parks and conservation laws to criminalize indigenous ways of life and enforce settler colonial dominance in the West Bank. One case in point is when Israel declared wild herbs like za'atar and akub, which are central to the Palestinian diet, as protected. By extending nature protection laws by military order to the West Bank in 2005, the Israeli government effectively criminalized a practice that had been central to the Palestinian way of life for ages, with jail time and fines. These laws exclusively target Palestinians, according to court documents that are cited in academic studies, and others have coined these discriminatory colonial practices as Green Zionism. While Israel now allows some harvesting of these herbs, Palestinians still face penalties, as limits are often unclear or too little to allow for a meaningful harvest. I first learned about this so-called conservation policy from the 2022 documentary called Foragers, which centers the story of Palestinians impacted by these laws.
خارج الحوك לאסור מيتان ولا لخت ליערות לאסוף אוכל.
לא, אני רואה שאין מה לדבר איתך.
צמח מוגן. איזה צמח מוגן? האדמה לא שלכם. גם הצמח הוא לא שלכם, מה שצומח באדמה.
In that film, Palestinians explained that their tradition of foraging actually helped plants like za'atar grow better in the wild. And the laws that criminalize their harvest would mean that the herbs would not be tended to, or that they would accidentally be uprooted entirely in haste, as foragers would scramble to harvest quickly and avoid authorities who were hunting them down at the same time. What's more is now settlers are violently stealing lands from Palestinian farmers, and the documentary points out that Israeli settlers are given the license to farm these herbs so they can then sell them back to Palestinians who are banned from harvesting them in the first place. When Israel criminalized Palestinian foraging, it undermined a way of life that was built around sustainably harvesting the very plants that Israel's laws are supposed to now protect. This is eerily similar to the way that Canada and the US, in their quest to colonize the Pacific Northwest, criminalized the indigenous practice of the potlatch, not to be confused with potlucks, which is a tradition designed to protect the Pacific salmon. Now, Pacific salmon are a keystone species that have a unique trait called simulparity, which means that they give birth once and then die. Which means that the fish are particularly vulnerable to mass die-off events if their breeding grounds are disturbed. Now, long before Western scientists even coined this term in the 1950s, indigenous nations in what is now Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska had already built entire political economies and governance systems that helped protect salmon and the people who depended on them. The salmon were protected through systems that were implemented through the tradition of potlatch, a traditional feast where tribal leaders were incentivized to give away wealth, often in the form of food stores, especially to neighbors when their salmon runs failed in their territory. While these practices prevented overfishing, to Western colonizers, the practice was seen as anti-capitalist and nonsensical. One missionary even described potlatch as the most formidable obstacle to the Christianization and civilization of indigenous peoples. So what did the governments do? Well, Canada banned potlatch from 1885 until 1951, and the US informally did the same. This effectively dismantled a political economic model that had uniquely emerged from this region as a way to maintain healthy salmon populations, which are an essential keystone species for the entire ecosystem, and replace it with the political economy of the settler state. And it's only been in recent years, when salmon species were threatened, more than a century after the first potlatch bans were implemented, that Western academics have begun to understand the sophistication of these indigenous institutions. For example, a 2016 paper by a professor at George Mason University argued that the potlatch economy functioned like systems of fractional reserve banking, while another conservation institute even proposed modeling modern negotiations between the Canadian Crown and First Nations on principles that were central to potlatch as a way to create more just and fair outcomes. While there are some academics and experts who are searching for solutions to modern day problems by looking to the past at the very cultures that the American state tried to erase entirely in its process of colonizing the West, by and large, what was lost in that process is gonna stay that way. And that is the sad truth of what happens when a state wages a total war on a people and their food. And because food is at the heart of culture, when wars include attacks on food systems, it's a strategy that's meant to do more than just starve the enemy to death. It's also designed to destroy the political and economic fabric that sustains the soul of indigenous cultures. And this is exactly what happened in America, as it waged war on the First Nations of the Great Plains and the Pacific Northwest. And it's the exact same thing that's happening in Israel and Palestine today, as Israel wages total war in Gaza and destroys its ability to feed itself, and imposes restrictions and regulations in the West Bank to take over that territory as well. Guys, if you appreciated the analysis I gave in this video, please make sure that you follow me on Patreon. If you can subscribe there for free or as little as $1 a month. That support goes a long way in helping sustaining me so I can continue to keep doing videos like this one. Thank you guys so much for the support, and I'll see y'all on the next one.